The station agent did not put the money in Tomas Ryen's hand. He counted the coins into a black coal scoop, one by one, then tipped them onto the edge of a freight scale like they were scrap metal. Outside, sleet scratched at the windows. Tomas stood on the other side of the scale with a split pine trunk at his feet, a dull spade under one arm, and his cuffs dark with cinder dust from 6 weeks of railroad work. The agent held back $1.80. Damaged tools, he said. Tomas was 17. He had not damaged the tools. He had not stolen the missing sack of oats either. But the section boss needed a name, and Tomas was the easiest name in the bunkhouse to choose. He understood enough English to hear the word thief. He did not understand enough English to stop the door from closing behind him. By noon, he had $12.35, a trunk, one blanket, a cracked hand axe, a spade with no edge left on it, and nowhere in Dakota territory where his name meant anything. The railroad siding was called Canton Ridge, though there was no ridge, only open prairie, a depot, a lumber shed, 2 false front stores, a blacksmith shop, and a road that vanished into grass as if the earth had swallowed it. A frame shanty cost more than $40 if a man built it cheap. 650 board feet of pine, a keg of nails, tar paper, a second-hand stove, pipe, coal. Tomas sat on his trunk outside the lumber shed and worked the numbers until the numbers stopped being numbers and became a sentence. You cannot live. That was what the arithmetic said. A carpenter named Asa Pike found him there. Asa had 1 bad knee, 2 missing teeth, and a way of looking at young men as if most of them were barns built without braces. He had watched Tomas work the rail gang. He had watched him swing a spike maul with both hands and his whole back because he did not yet have the shoulders to do it any other way. Now Asa looked at the trunk, the spade, and the $12. You got kin? Tomas shook his head. Money east? No. Then listen clean, Asa said. A roof is wood, a door is wood, a floor is wood, a stove eats coal, winter eats everything else. You cannot build a house here with $12 in November. Tomas looked past him toward the wet grass south of town. There is land by the reed slough. Asa's face changed. Not surprise. Worse, recognition. Nobody buys the reed 40. Nobody wants it. That is because it is not land. It is a basin with a tax bill. It has earth, as do graves, Asa said. The reed 40 belonged to Isaac Marr, a paper-thin speculator who kept a desk in the back of the hardware store and made ruined men feel they had been given one more chance. Marr sold land the way a trap sells shade. He knew Tomas was a miner. He knew the parcel flooded in April, baked in July, and froze hard by Christmas. He knew a court would not protect a boy's deed the way it protected a grown man's claim. That was the point. He sold it for $8.25. No wagon road, no survey guarantee, no timber, no promise that the title would stand if someone with money decided to test it. Tomas put the coins on Marr's desk. Marr wrote the receipt without looking up. Why would you buy a wet hole? Tomas folded the deed into the oilcloth notebook that had belonged to his mother. Because a wet hole is still lower than the wind. Marr smiled then. Not kindly. Winter will correct you. That night, Tomas dragged his trunk to the slough and slept under an abandoned wagon bed with the blanket wrapped around his shoulders. The boards blocked the sky. They did not block the wind. The wind came through every crack, under every plank, around every edge, finding the gaps as if it had fingers. Before dawn, he crawled away from the wagon and down against a cutbank where the slough's shoulder rose 3 feet above the frozen reeds. There, with his back pressed to earth, something changed. The cold was still there, but the wind was not. Above him the wagon rattled like a tin cup full of nails. Behind him the bank did not move. It did not argue. It did not shake. It simply held. Tomas remembered his mother's hands. Not her face first, her hands. Red from wash water, black at the nails from peat, pressing turf into the roof of a summer storehouse in Norway before fever took her voice and then her breath. She had made him touch the seam between two blocks of sod. Winter enters by the crack before it asks for the doorway, she had told him. He had been 11 then. He had thought she was talking about walls. Now he understood she had been talking about survival. He opened the notebook. Inside were sketches no American carpenter would call a house. Low turf roofs, earth shelves, smoke vents, ditches, layered blocks cut so the roots crossed instead of running straight. His mother had not left him money. She had left him a way to think. And in that gray hour before sunrise, with sleet hardening in the grass and the town asleep behind him, Tomas stopped trying to build a house the Prairie could attack. He would build something the Prairie could not find, not up, down, not walls, weight, not a roof fighting the wind. A piece of ground persuaded to cover a man. He dug the first cut before daylight. The hole was ugly, 8 feet wide, 13 feet long, 2 feet deep on the high side, less on the low side, with a crooked drainage scratch leading toward the slough. He cut turf from the rim where sedge roots held the soil in a woven mat. Some blocks came up black and wet and broke in his hands. Those he threw away. Some bent without bleeding water. Those he kept. By the 4th day his palms had opened. By the 6th, the skin on his knuckles had split. By the 9th, the town had a name for what he was building. The rat burrow. Children dared each other to run near it. The blacksmith said he did not shoe horses for dead boys in advance. Isaac Marr rode out with the town clerk and looked down from his saddle at the pit, the turf piles, and the young Norwegian standing shin-deep in mud, with a rag wrapped around his right hand. "A hole does not make a homestead," Marr said. Tomas looked up. "Then I have not taken much from you." The clerk looked away. Marr leaned forward in the saddle. "If this thing collapses, I will have it declared a nuisance. If you miss tax, I will challenge the deed. If you freeze, I will bury you cheap and take the land back clean." The wind moved through the dead reeds. Tomas said nothing. After Marr left, the help disappeared. A woman who had let Tomas draw water from her well said the bucket rope was frayed. A farmer who had offered 2 days of fence work suddenly had sons enough for the job. Men who might have traded scraps for labor decided Marr was a poor enemy to buy for a boy they barely knew. So Tomas worked hungry. He ate cattail root that tasted like wet paper. He trapped one prairie hen with baling wire. He boiled it in a coffee tin and drank the grease as if it were soup. The frame went up with willow poles and wagon scrap. No nails where he could lash. No boards where brush would do. He wove the willow ribs like basket cane, packed reeds over them, smeared clay into the gaps, then began laying turf in staggered courses. Root to clay, root to sky. Seams broken like brickwork. The windward side faced northwest. That side had to be thickest, 18 inches to start, 2 feet if the ground stayed soft long enough. The entry would face southeast, then turn sharply before it entered the chamber, so the draft would lose itself in the bend. A man could not walk in. He would have to crawl. That was the point. A standing door was an invitation. A crawling door was a question the wind did not know how to answer. The ground hardened every morning. The spade rang instead of cut. Tomas began to count time not by days, but by how deep the blade went before his boot stopped it. Then Nils Arneson arrived. He was 68, though he looked older when he was still, and younger when he moved. A Norwegian ditcher from the settlement near Swan Lake, Nils had spent half his life telling water where to go, and the other half being ignored until the water proved him right. He had walked to Canton Ridge to repair a harness strap. He stopped at the slough because of the pile, not the pit. Anybody could dig a pit. The pile told him the boy knew something. Tomas had separated the turf into 2 stacks, black wet blocks on the left, springy root-bound blocks on the right. Nils picked up one from the left and squeezed. Water ran over his wrists. He picked up one from the right. It flexed and held. Nils said in Norwegian, "You are not choosing dirt." Tomas froze. He had not heard his own language from another mouth in weeks. Nils turned the block in his hands. "You are choosing skin." That was the first lesson. The second was worse. Nils climbed onto the half-finished roof and found 2 seams that lined up. He pulled the blocks off without asking. "Meltwater loves a straight road," he said. "Give it 1 seam, it will enter. Give it 2 seams in a row, it will build a door." He laid the blocks again with a handspan of overlap. Never stack weakness in a line. The third lesson nearly choked Tomas. Nils built a small, smoky fire inside the unfinished chamber using damp sedge and green willow bark. Thick smoke filled the roof space. Tomas coughed until his eyes streamed. "Stay," Nils said. "I cannot breathe. Neither can the roof." "Good." The smoke crawled along the reed mat, into every hairline crack, through the first course of turf, drying it slowly without enough heat to split the clay. "Fire bakes too fast," Nils said. "Smoke teaches patience." When they opened the vent and the entry together, gray smoke poured out and vanished into the cold. Tomas pressed his palm against the underside of the roof. The clay had tightened. The reeds had stiffened. The inside surface felt less like mud and more like a shell. His mother had drawn it. Nils taught him why it worked. For 3 weeks, they moved like men racing a door that was closing. Cut at dawn, drain at noon, lay before dark, smoke cure at night. Deepen the trench whenever thaw or melt threatened the floor. Nils would not sleep inside. He built a lean-to 50 paces away and said he preferred hearing the wind without a roof flattering it. Tomas understood later. The old man stayed near because the boy would not ask to be saved. Asa Pike came once after a warm rain caved the southeast corner. He stood above the pit while Tomas repacked clay with bare hands. "That is why men use boards," Asa said. "Boards would have given the wind edges." Asa looked at the bowed ridgepole. "If that slips, the north face will pour into your lap." He left. An hour later he returned with a cedar post. "I had 1 extra," he said. "Do not make gratitude out of it." He set the brace himself. He wedged it tight. The roof line lifted 1/2 inch, and the whole shelter stopped sounding tired. By Christmas week, the burrow was finished. From the stock path, it looked less like a building than a dark-backed animal asleep in the reeds. A low mound of frozen turf, a slit of an entry hidden behind dead grass, a tin-lined smoke hole no wider than a stovepipe, a drainage trench cut above the chamber and curved away toward the slough. Inside, there was only enough height to sit at the ridge. The sleeping shelf was made of scrap planks and bundled sedge, raised above the damp floor. The stove was a cracked iron box patched with clay and wire. The vent at the base of the entry fed it just enough air to draw clean. It was not comfortable. It was not pretty. It did one thing better than any frame shack on the prairie. It refused to give the wind a face. In early January, Tomas tested it. He filled a tin pail with water and set it on the sleeping shelf. He asked Asa to leave a second pail inside his tool shed. A tight little building with board walls and a shingled roof. By morning, Asa's pail wore a skin of ice thick enough to lift with 2 fingers. Tomas's pail had only a rim of frost. Asa stared at the 2 pails for a long time. Then he said, "Low things do not brag." That was as close as he came to an apology. The weather turned strange after that. Mild mornings, black nights, snow that melted in the afternoon and froze before supper. Fence posts cracked. Water barrels burst. Men called it a confused winter, because that was easier than saying the sky felt wrong. January 12th opened warm, too warm. Women shook rugs outside. Men walked to town with coats unbuttoned. At the schoolhouse west of the siding, children were allowed out at noon because the sun had softened the icicles under the eaves. By early afternoon, the northwest horizon became a black wall. Not gray, black. The south wind stopped. For 2 minutes, nothing moved. Then the wall arrived. The temperature fell as if the earth had dropped through a trapdoor. Snow did not fall. It appeared everywhere, all at once, ice dust so fine it entered the lungs like ground glass. In 15 minutes, Tomas could not see the slough from the entry. In 30, he could not see his own hand. He crawled inside, sealed the wool flap, and fed the stove with twists of dry grass and peat. Small fire, steady fire, never large enough to waste fuel, never low enough to let the walls surrender their heat. The smoke hole backdrafted when the wind hit the tin cap. Tomas opened the low vent, exactly as Nils had taught him. Cold air entered beneath the flap, fed the stove, and pulled the smoke upward again. The draft steadied. The roof groaned once. Then it settled. Outside, Canton Ridge shook. Frame walls rattled. Stovepipes screamed. Snow drove through window cracks and door seams and nail holes. Inside the earthback, there was no rattle. Only the stove, the breathing, the huge white violence passing overhead without finding a place to grip. Then something hit the entry. Not a knock. A body. Tomas tied a rope around his waist and looped the other end around the cedar brace. He crawled through the dogleg tunnel into the storm. The wind struck his face so hard he felt it in his teeth. A man was on his knees outside the entry. Will Tate, the freighter who had mocked the burro louder than anyone. His beard was white with ice. His hands were useless claws. Behind him, against the turf wall, 2 children crouched in the drift. Will had been hauling the school teacher's younger pupils toward town when the storm erased the road. The horse bolted. The wagon tipped. Direction vanished. He had carried one child and dragged the other until he fell against the mound he had once called a rat hole. Tomas pulled Will inside first. Then he went back out for the children. A boy of 10, a girl of 7 burning with fever under a frozen scarf. The rope snapped tight twice. The tunnel filled with driven snow. The flap crusted stiff, but the entry held. 4 people now. In a shelter built for one. Tomas laid the girl on the sleeping shelf near the warm wall. He rubbed the boy's hands. He put Will against the clay bank and made him breathe slowly until the coughing stopped. 2 hours later, something scraped across the roof. Slow, heavy, dragging. Tomas tied the rope again and pushed through the tunnel. A hand caught his sleeve. Nils, half conscious. Beard sealed with ice. Coat torn open where the wind had ripped the buttons free. He had seen Will's overturned wagon from the edge of town and gone looking, because he was the kind of man who had spent too many winters understanding what happened when nobody went. Tomas hauled him in. 5 people, 1 stove, 1 shelf, one low roof holding against the worst storm any of them had ever heard. The night became a set of tasks. Feed the stove, check the vent, turn the girl toward the heat. Rub Will's hands until pain came back into them. Listen to Nils breathe. Feed the stove again. The pail on the sleeping shelf did not freeze. The girl's fever broke before dawn. Nils opened his eyes once, looked at the curved roof above him, and whispered in Norwegian, "Your mother built in this dark." Then he closed his eyes again. Morning did not bring sun, it brought shape. The wind lowered from a scream to a moan, and the white wall thinned enough for Tomas to crawl out and stand on the roof. The slough was gone, the stock path was gone. Fence posts had vanished. The world had been sanded smooth by snow. But beneath his boots, the turf was solid. The wind had packed snow over it like another blanket. No lifted seam, no torn edge, no broken wall. Below him, 5 people were alive. In town, not every chimney smoked. A section hand had frozen less than 60 yards from the bunkhouse. The Hadley barn lost its north wall. One claim shanty, 3 miles out, burned chairs, table legs, and finally, a door for heat before the family crawled under bedding and waited for the sound to stop. Asa Pike was found behind a haystack with frost-blackened fingertips. He had tried to reach the slough with a lantern and a rope from his fence post. The lantern blew out. The rope ended. The hay saved him by doing what the earthback had done. It stood low and let the wind spend itself above him. He lost 2 fingertips. He did not lose his life. Will Tate told the story in the store 2 days later. He held up his bandaged hands. "I laughed at that hole," he said. "Then I crawled into it and heard the storm go over us like it had missed its target." Nobody laughed then. The schoolgirl's mother brought the frozen scarf to the town meeting and laid it on the clerk's table. "It thawed on his shelf," she said. "So did my child." Isaac Marr still filed his complaint. Unsafe structure. Public nuisance. Illegal habitation by a minor. Unimproved wetland. He had paper. Tomas had a deed, a tax receipt, and 5 living witnesses. Asa stood before the township board with his left hand wrapped. "I have built half the cheap shanties in this county," he said. "Good boards, bad boards, straight walls, crooked walls. None of them saved 5 people in a single night. This one did. If that is not improvement, then the word is too proud for this place." Will stood next. The schoolgirl's mother did not argue. She placed the thawed scarf beside the deed. The room understood. The board did not make Tomas safe forever. Men with papers rarely give up that cleanly. But they tabled Marr's challenge until Tomas reached majority, and they ordered that no one interfere with the shelter or the drainage works as long as the taxes were paid. Marr gathered his papers and passed Tomas at the door. "A delay is not a victory." Tomas looked at him. "I know," he said. "That is how I built the roof." 1 block delayed the wind, then another, until the wind had nowhere useful left to go. Spring tested the earthback harder than winter. Winter had attacked from above. Spring came from underneath. Snow melted in sheets. The slough rose. Water searched for weakness with more patience than wind. Marr told anyone who would listen that the whole thing would dissolve into black soup. The first copied shelter almost proved him right. A German family west of the siding built too fast after the blizzard. They copied the mound and the tunnel, but not the trench. When thaw came, meltwater ran downhill, entered the door, soaked the lower turf courses, and turned the floor to cold paste. They called the design a fraud. Tomas walked the site and saw the failure before he reached the entry. The door faced downhill. The trench was missing. The turf had been cut from the wet center instead of the dry rim. The house had not failed. The listening had. He cut a diversion trench with his own spade, raised the entry sill with clay, repacked the lower courses root out so the living mat would bind the wall as it dried. Then he wrote the lesson in the back of the notebook, drainage before walls. Water decides first. Nils died in March. The cold from the blizzard had settled deep in his lungs, and no stove could draw it out. On his last morning, he asked Tomas to open the flap so he could hear the wind. The air came in damp with thaw and grass. Nils breathed once, smiled as if he recognized the weather, and said, "Make water work, or it will take the house back." Then his breathing stopped. Tomas wrapped the notebook in oilcloth that night. His mother's pages, Nils's corrections, his own new drawings, not a book of memories, a book of instructions. By summer, 3 earthback shelters stood within wagon distance of Canton Ridge. By the next winter, there were 6. Not all were homes. Most were storm rooms, root cellars, lambing shelters, places to crawl into when the northwest sky went black and a frame house started talking in its nails. Asa never became a turf builder. He was too old and too proud to give up right angles. But he began banking north walls with sod. He lowered roof lines when owners would allow it. He set doors southeast. He built with less confidence and more respect. "You did not invent shelter," he told Tomas once. "You remembered something we were too new to know." Will Tate built one for strangers on the stock road and swore at the clay for 2 days. When it was done, he sat inside with the draft dead at the bend of the tunnel and said, "Fine." The rat was wiser than the carpenter. Tomas married the schoolgirl's older sister 3 years later. After she helped turn his broken English instructions into clean numbered pages that farmers could carry in a coat pocket. They built a frame house on the highest dry rise of the Reed 40. She wanted windows. Tomas wanted walls he could stand inside without bowing his neck. So they built both, a house with glass, and behind it, the old earthback kept clear, sealed, drained, and ready. The wet parcel never became good cropland. It grew sedge, it held water, it kept its own counsel, but it also held potatoes cool through July, it held lambs alive through March. It held children safe when the sky went black, and every year, before hard frost, Tomas walked the trench with Nils ditching level in his hand, and listened for water before it could speak loudly. Years later, people stopped calling it the rat burrow. Some called it Ryan's roof. Some called it the slough shelter. Most stopped naming it at all. They simply built lower when the land told them to. They cut from the root-bound rim. They broke the seams. They smoked the inner shell. They dug the trench before they praised the wall. Knowledge had entered the county the way roots enter soil. Quietly, sideways, binding what looked loose. Tomas's children played on the old mound and were told not to jump because it was not a hill. They laughed when their father said it had once been a house. He let them laugh. Their laughter meant they had never been forced to crawl into the ground with a rope around their waist, reaching through white darkness for a hand. And that was the point. Isaac Marr once said winter would correct the boy. Winter tried. It corrected the town instead. It corrected tall walls. It corrected proud roofs. It corrected the belief that shelter had to stand up straight to be real. A January wind still crossed the prairie. After that, it still struck barns, signs, fences, and frame houses first. It still looked for edges, for cracks, for doors, for anything that would let it begin. Then it reached the low dark mound beside the reed slough, the one shaped like the earth had decided to hold its breath. The wind climbed the slope. It found no wall. It found no straight seam. It found no open crack before the doorway, so it passed over. And inside, the air did not move.